So, Jack, let me ask you a question about the anxiety suffused society in which we find ourselves. And this is a question I'm very interested in personally. So, to what extent do you think about creating the ideal environment for yourself and your loved ones versus adjusting to an anxiety suffused society that is unlikely to be wholly changed by your efforts? And it makes me think of a very often quoted quote of Krishnamurti's, which is, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." But one could argue that that is absolving yourself of any responsibility. So how do you think about choosing between those two, or a ratio between those two, or contending with that tension if you see any tension between those two?
I love your question because it's a little like a Zen koan. The world is on fire, it's in flames. Do I stay around and try to put the fire out, or the Titanic's going down? Do I help people into the lifeboats? Or do I flee? Do I go in the mountains, or do I get a little lifeboat and so forth? Do I stay or do I go? Mm-hmm. And the answer to those kind of koans is yes. Which you point to. You gave the little mathematical answer. How do you titrate it in some fashion? Because I think it's both. The metaphor that everyone uses these days is, put on your oxygen mask first before you put it on your children. There's a way in which we have a responsibility to ourselves to try to stay healthy and well. And I know, if I go into a refugee camp, it doesn't help if I go in and I'm depressed and anxious. They're already feeling that. They don't need me to breathe. They actually need somebody who says, yeah, this is suffering and there are ways to manage it. There are ways, even though it's difficult, there are ways and there are possibilities for us. The great anthropologist and philosopher Wade Davis said, despair is a failure of the imagination.
That's a good one.
It's a brilliant line because it speaks to the heart. Despair is a failure of the imagination. Human beings have been in tough times since caves and saber-toothed tigers, since, battles between different clans. And then we don't have to talk about the Huns and the Visigoths, or the Roman army, or the armies of the Aztecs, or wherever around the world. We human beings have dealt with epidemics, floods, tornadoes. Continuing war is not a new story, right? And we're survivors. And we survive in two ways. First of all, we survive by protecting what we care about, which is ourselves and those close to us. So I do that. I want to protect my grandson, have him live in a place where it's safe, if that's possible, or safe enough, or myself. But I also don't want to turn away for two reasons. My daughter said, well, if climate change and everything gets bad, would you move to New Zealand, or would you get it? And I said, I choose to be on the deck of the Titanic, and I'll help people in the lifeboats. That's what I've taken as a vow, as a bodhisattva, that you turn toward suffering and you offer what you can. But part of that offering is to see that the world that I want for my grandson needs my tending. And it doesn't mean I can change it, because this is the way of the world in some ways. But it can be better or it can be worse, and we know that. We can stand up for things that really matter. And so your question, which is it's a question of the heart, it's also different for different people. There's some people who are profoundly contemplative, and I think the extreme are those Tibetan yogis in a cave who are broadcasting compassion to everybody in the world. If we're all connected, as they say, as we find, then that's their contribution. But then there I was out on the streets in March for Your Lives in DC for this, and that was also important. And I love the fact it was not this one, but with the prior March for Your Lives. I forget who it was, but there was a fantastic, black gospel singer who stood up, and she sang in a sort of gospel style, Bob Dylan's "The Times They Are a Changin'," 40 years after it came out. Gather around, people, the times are changing, don't block up the wall. And I listened, and it was the very same medicine that we needed. And I felt so glad to be out there with people. And I felt so glad that we were doing lobbying, petitions, and sending money and trying to support the organizations and do what we could. And I've also worked with kids coming out of street gangs in the cities. And they're veterans too. When we've had retreats with Army veterans, military veterans coming back, combat veterans, and some of these young kids, they look at each other in their eyes and they nod, and they know that they've all been together in battle, because some of these kids have seen as much shooting as some of these vets have. And so we actually need to tend to that. And it becomes part of our, really part of our life purpose in some way. Yes, to take care of yourself, but yourself isn't separate. To take care of yourself is everything.